Thank you so much to both for your introduction, and thank you to all of you for joining this evening, running the gamut of that obviously terrifying protest outside. And I am extremely sorry about having to leave early, and I apologise enormously for that. But most of all, I am thankful and grateful to all of you as both individuals and as representatives of various activist groups that you're with, for everything that you've done to get us to the place where we are now in terms of conversation about the Gender Recognition Act and about the issue of gender identity and women's rights in general. So 5 years ago, in fact, I was checking this when I was working on the speech, and it is 5 years ago, almost to the day, that I first expressed my very, very timorous doubts about gender identity ideology. And I was talking to two friends, and even talking to two friends, it felt like I was doing a reckless, secret thing. Fittingly enough, I was at a Mumsnet event, although at the time I had absolutely no idea that Mumsnet was going to end up being so integral to the protection of women's rights. I should have known, because there is nothing as radicalising for women as getting together in a place where men are not keeping an eye on us. So of course it would be Mumsnet. Anyway, so I had been on a panel with Victoria Smith, Glosswitch. It had gone, in this case, things with Mumsnet had not gone so well. The panel had gone quite badly. In fact, we'd been booed. It was awful. And so we went to a bar afterwards with Helen Lewis, who edits both of us on the New Statesman. And so I drank a gin and tonic very quickly, and then I said, I'm not sure that trans activism is compatible with feminism. And I felt scared saying that, even to two people who were my friends, who I trusted. I was scared that they might condemn me. I was scared that I might actually be a bigot for thinking the things that I was thinking. I imagine that lots of you have similarly had that sort of painful experience of first speaking up, or of first forming your thoughts into those words. They didn't turn on me, and both of them have been really key figures in getting us to the place where public debate is now in the UK. Helen, in terms of the debate that she has fostered as an editor at the New Statesman and her own writing on the subject. Victoria, through her writing. Thanks to them, to people like them, to everyone who has gone before them on this subject, we are in a place where women are finally being heard. Politicians are no longer simply repeating the cliches that Stonewall and mermaids have put into their mouths. MPs like Caroline Flint and David T. Davis have both raised women's rights in Parliament, but even one-time political cheerleaders for Gender Recognition Act reform have gone a little cold on it, I think. I was listening to the Today programme last week, and Maria Miller, who I am sure you all know, was the architect of the Gender Recognition Act reform plans through her role as head of the Women and Equality Select Committee. She was asked about GRA reform, and she actually said that she didn't think that the Gender Recognition Act was the most important part of things, and that it was actually more about funding the NHS for trans people. I think that's significant. I think that parliamentary will for this has faded for fairly obvious reasons. The media is beginning to do the job of properly interrogating activist claims and demands. I've mentioned the New Statesman's role in this. The Times and the Sunday Times has been sterling in terms of both comment by Janice Turner, but news reporting from Andrew Gilligan and Lucy Bannerman has really moved things forward. I mean, it's one thing for us to say as feminists that something could happen, but when you have the kind of reporting that Lucy and Andrew have been putting together, showing what has been happening, it's awful, the things that have been happening, but that changes people's minds. James Kirkup, also excellent in The Spectator, but even The Guardian, which has, I mean, until recently it felt like Hadley Freeman was the lone voice of reason on The Guardian. Recently ran an editorial making a really neutral, simple argument about the fact that there are competing rights between women and trans people when it comes to Gender Recognition Act reform. It's really important because despite what Owen Jones might claim about being the conscience of the paper and the left in general, an editorial, a leader article, is actually the line of the paper. We've been listened to. We have been heard. And it does seem possible now that reform of the Gender Recognition Act to give legal force to self-ID will not go ahead. I think this is an incredible achievement. Even to be in the place where it might not happen is an incredible achievement. Remember, this is a proposal that had the support of every political party, apart from UKIP. Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn both publicly backed it. The media was pretty much united in favour of it. Even the Mail, which is the bastion of reactionary forces, has run some really positive coverage for groups like Mermaids. Lobby groups like Stonewall, Liberty and Amnesty, these are like the conscience of the left groups, all in favour of it. And the other thing that was in its favour is that there is basically no time to make any legislation because of Brexit. And Gender Recognition Act reform looked like one simple, easy thing that you could walk through the door, that would make everyone look socially liberal, would be popular in the country at large. It's not actually popular in the country at large, but politicians are under the impression that it would be. Would cost no money, which is another big thing that you could say in its favour. Something that you could fit in, even when there are no other achievements. This looked like something that could be accomplished. The Women Equalities Committee report in 2016 seemed to fix this decisively. This was a select committee report that said, reform the Gender Recognition Act, change the Equality Act, and demedicalise the entire process. And the government response to that, sanely at least, rejected the Equality Act part, but it was all for reforming the Gender Recognition Act. This looked like something that was definitely going to happen. 2 years later, the Gender Recognition Act remains unreformed. What seemed irresistible has been resisted so far. That is something that feminists, that women working together have achieved. I am enormously impressed and very proud to have been a small part of that. But the cost of getting to this point has been tremendous. The women who got there before I did and were brave enough to speak up when few others were willing have paid an extraordinary price. Julie Bindle's career has been wounded by slander and no platforming. That is terrible. Janice Raymond is a pariah. She is one of the sharpest feminist minds in the world, and people won't listen to her. Sheila Jeffreys has written extraordinary scholarship on women's services and women's needs, and it's simply ruled out of bounds because she doesn't hold an approved position on gender. Maria McLachlan is assaulted for speaking up for women's rights. Linda Bellis is being harassed in court by a trans activist. And worse, victims of Karen White, who was sexually assaulted in prison, where the state had a duty to keep them safe. They had to be assaulted by a male in prison before people would believe that something feminists have said all along was a possible, plausible, likely outcome of saying trans women are women, full stop. They have had to pay with their bodies, essentially, for this experiment. It's hideous. And it's not just the victims who were the subject of the prosecution, but every woman in that prison was a victim. Every woman forced into close quarters with a sex offender, with a male who they had every right to feel afraid of and intimidated by. Every one of them is a victim of gender identity ideology. It's heinous. I'm thinking as well of all the vital services for women that have already been eroded. Refuges, toilets, hospital wards that have already been made gender neutral by default. Because in the same way that Gender Recognition Act reform was a cheap, simple solution to looking liberal, making your services gender neutral is a cheap, simple solution to looking liberal. You don't have to spend very much money to change the signs on a toilet door. But when you do change the signs on a toilet door, you steal something from women. You take away from women the services that give them a fair and safe share of society. Because, I'm thinking of every child who's been hurried along the track to transition with the help of schools and youth groups advised by mermaids. What is going to happen to those children when they are old enough to realise that they have had their fertility, had their sexual function traded for a lifetime of medicalisation just so that they could be normal? I think it is something that is distressingly terrible to think about, to be honest. This is experimental medical science that is being tried on live subjects who are children. I mean, a drug that causes infertility is, by definition, a drug that would not be licensed in any circumstance apart from life-saving treatment for cancer or apparently making somebody the right gender for their behaviour. It's frightening. And all of these things have happened without reform of the Gender Recognition Act, which should tell us that resisting reform of the Gender Recognition Act is not enough. The legislation is significant because it has pushed the issue into public consciousness. Changing the Gender Recognition Act would absolutely have a legal impact on women's lives and on interpretation of the Equality Act. But even with the law where it is now, so much has already happened. And there is so much more to fight for than just keeping the law where it is now. And I want to talk this evening about what happens next. Opposition to gender extremism has inspired women to forge a mass movement of the kind that hasn't been seen for decades. It's a really impressive, moving thing to see. But the Gender Recognition Act is also, in a way, it's like the Brexit of feminism, right? We are all, right? We are all arguing about it all the time, talking about it all the time. We can't do anything until it's resolved. And when it is resolved, all the problems that led to it are still going to exist, and all the problems it's caused are still going to have to be solved. So what I hope will happen is for us to take the energy and organisation that we've brought to this fight and keep it going. The attempt to replace sex with self-identified gender has been the most flagrant attack on the laws designed to protect women, but it's not the only way that the Equality Act has been undermined. Protections against sexual harassment and workplace discrimination have been removed from the books by the coalition government. It's a big problem. Female public sector workers in Glasgow have just been on strike because their council spent a decade and I think as much as £1 billion on defending a wage system that unfairly benefited men. Gender Recognition Act is not the only bad law that affects women's lives. Abortion, as I'm sure you know, is still covered by the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act, which is a law that predates women's right to own property. And there's the issue of how the law is implemented. So if you follow the work of Justice for Women, a superb, pioneering, brilliant legal foundation for women, you know that women are still legally treated as second-class citizens because they're female. The Crown Prosecution Service is failing rape victims. When women are found guilty of a crime, they're thrown into a justice system that has no regard for their needs. The issue of gender identity has shone a light on the treatment of women in prison, but ensuring women aren't incarcerated with rapists is a very scant minimum of what we owe to women whose liberty has been removed from them by society. There is much, much more that we should be doing. As trans rhetoric about the marriage veto throws into relief the failings of divorce law. There is no marriage veto. It is a terrible sleight of hand for what's actually a legal mechanism that allows the spouse of someone who transitions to dissolve the marriage when their partner fundamentally changes the terms of the marriage contract by changing their legal sex. Because other than that, if you don't have that mechanism, you are thrown into the divorce system in this country, which is a brutal, punishing, awful, fault-based system that breaks people's lives and that men can use to continue to harass women. We need no-fault divorce for everyone, not just a change in the law that traps women with their trans husbands. Women are suffering from the cuts to social care. Many of you here will already be bearing caring responsibilities for elderly or disabled relatives, because when the system fails, it is female hands that are expected to pick up the mess. The exploitation of women is the dirt that our society has grown in. Not just exploitation of our labour, but sexual exploitation as well. The law on prostitution, which further victimises women who are abused by pimps and punters. And I think it's really worth thinking about the fact that, you know, when we as feminists object to the right of men to exploit women sexually, to, you know, lease women by the screw, we get called pearl clutchers by trans activists like Paris Lees. There are ways in which trans activism has enormously impeded feminism's ability to take on the fundamental stuff of women's oppression. Pornography is the propaganda of patriarchy. The trans activist Jane Fay is also an activist for extreme pornography. We have to be critical about these connections. We have to look at who is taking on the mantle of driving this movement and what they are gaining from it. And then, we've been told that the sex wars were fought and lost in the last century, but we thought that the gender wars have been fought and lost as well. We can do so much more for women with the movement that we've been able to build. I did write far too much. I got excited. Standing firm on the fact that women exist is not enough to bring about women's liberation. It's a necessary condition for women's liberation, but it is not going to achieve our liberation on its own. So when we see off Gender Recognition Act reform, I hope that we are going to look to what comes next after keeping the law where it is. We've spoken up for women, we are finally being heard, but we need to speak next for the female future.